Hello, I'm Susan Johnson. I'm the membership secretary for the International Wizard of Oz Club. I'd like to read a story for you from the 1971 edition of Oziana. This is our very first publication. The title of the story is The Patchwork Girl and the Giant. It was written by Harry Mongold and it was illustrated by Bill Eubanks. Both Harry and Bill were early members of the Oz Club and attended some of those earliest conventions in the late 60s and early 70s. The Patchwork Girl and the Giant. One of the merriest of the people in Oz was Scraps, the Patchwork Girl. She was made of crazy quilt and stuffed with cotton, with yarn hair and button eyes. When she had been brought to life, there had been too much cleverness mixed in with her brains and an unusual number of other things. As a result, she was full of silliness and poetry and hated to sit still. One evening, she bounced down the palace steps in the Emerald City and fell flat on the walk in front of Princess Dorothy. "What are you doing?" laughed Dorothy, who was a regular little girl and had lived in Kansas before moving to the land of Oz to stay. "You scared my kitten. Come out of the bushes, Eureka. It's only Scraps." "This is no time of day for her to be flopping around," grumbled the kitten, creeping out from under a hedge. She had lived in the city for many years, but had never shown signs of growing all the way into a cat. This was because in Oz, everyone grows just as old as he wants to be and no more. "If I feel like flopping, I will flop," declared Scraps. "So it is no use telling me about the time of day." She stood up, threw her arms out straight, and spun her top half around without moving her feet. This twisted her and flopped her down again. Eureka ran up the steps to the door of the palace. "Come on, Dorothy. She'll be getting dust all over you." "Yes, Scraps, for goodness sake," said Dorothy. "I barely have time up to wash up before dinner as it is." She ran after the kitten and did not wait for Scraps to join her, because the Cotton Maiden often was absent from the table at meal times. Naturally, she ate nothing and came only if she felt interested in conversation. Tonight, she waltzed down the main street to the gate in the city wall, where the guardian of the gate promptly let her out. Then she turned a long series of cartwheels that took her halfway around the city before she decided which way to go. There were no hills close to the Emerald City. Scraps had a notion she wanted to lie down on the top of a hill and roll all the way down to the bottom. It sounded like great fun, and since she was made of cotton, she could not hurt herself. Therefore, she chose the direction in which the hills seemed closest. As she skipped toward them, she sang, "Your people, some people like to eat good celery and meat, and artichokes and wheat, but I'm not made like that. I never touch the stuff. I keep my figure flat, and yet I'm tough enough." It occurred to her that it might be pleasant to get herself lost. After all, it had been a long time since she had had an adventure. As she did not recognize the hills she finally came to, it looked as though she had a good start. She rolled down their slopes until a light in the eastern sky showed that the moon was about to rise. Then she started to somersault up an extra big hill. She rarely paid attention to where she was going, as long as there was no water around that she might fall into. And this time she somersaulted right into a big oak. "Woohoo, woohoo there," demanded a voice from the tree. Scraps sat up and peered into the branches. As she could see well in the dark, she had no trouble spotting a little screech owl perched there. "Scraps is the name," she said in her saucy voice. "I am the only patchwork girl in Oz." The owl seemed to have nothing in particular to say to this and merely replied, "Hoo, hoo, hoo." Why is it you are hooing? Has someone got you stewing? Surely you can think of something better to be doing, cried Scraps, bouncing herself up and down where she sat. Who knows? Commented the little fellow. Do you start all your sentences with who? Woo-hoo, why not? Woo-hoo, whenever possible I do. I find it much a comforting sound. I bet it isn't really that. I bet you say who because you were born an owl. Woo-hoo, what makes you think that? You look like an owl. You sound like an owl, and therefore I think you are an owl. That's what. That's why you hoot in that shivery why all the time. Hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. I hoo-hoo it because I like it. Well, hoo-hoo, hooray, shouted Scraps. She stood on her head and watched the light get brighter, where the moon was due to come up over the hill. The owl hooted once or twice, and then, speaking for the first time like any other bird in Oz, she said, I have a problem. The cotton-stuffed maiden fell flat on her face and then flopped over to stare with her button eyes. What kind of a problem? Hoo-hoo-hoo, am I? I was blown up here by a big man, and I can't get back home. Blown here? You mean like this? Scraps sat up and blew a seeded dandelion till all the feathery seeds flew off. That is just the way he did. How big a man was he? She asked, lying down again. The owl cocked his little head to look at her carefully. He was as long as 30 of you, hoo-hoo, she declared. 30? Why, he was a giant. You say a giant blew you up here? She sat up and clasped her gloved hands together in excitement. See, I live beyond a narrow canyon between two cliffs. Last night, I decided to travel to see the world. I flew through the canyon, and there I saw the big man lying on his stomach, blowing water uphill. That's a silly thing to do. I went around his head to where I could talk with him, but then I got caught in his blow. And then what happened? He blew hoo-hoo and blew hoo-hoo. How you stutter, Scraps remarked. I found myself just above the stream of water, and the water I was sailing uphill. Now, here we are. I don't see any water. It's up there. The bird's little wing pointed to the top of the hill. The water got up there and made a lake. Do you want to get back home? It's hopeless, said the owl, shaking its head. Every time I try to go down, hoo-hoo, where the big man is, I get blown back up. It's kind of lightweight myself, but I can find a way past that giant. Follow me. Confidently, Scraps sprang up and began to dance around the side of the hill. That isn't the way, cried the owl. You go to the top first. No. That is where you made your mistake. You tried to go down the same way you came up and got blown back again, she sang. Although I'm made of cotton, my brains are not so rotten. I'm learning every night and day, and most I've not forgotten. The owl flew after her. They went around the hill, going downward until the canyon came into view. They saw smoke coming out from behind the first cliff, at which the owl gave a surprised hoot. He hooted again at the stream of water, for now it was trickling downhill toward the canyon. It looks like the giant has turned its blower off, said Scraps. The smoke is floating out, and the water is acting like any ordinary stream. When they turned into the canyon, they discovered the giant seated on the floor of it, with his great legs stretched out in front of him. Although the canyon was deep, his head came nearly to the top of it. He was smoking a log pipe, which made the smoke, and he was behind a growing pool of water where the stream flowed in. One of his hands was even larger than it should have been for the size of the rest of him. With this extra large hand, he was holding back the water, damming it so that it would not flow around him and into the canyon. Let's sneak past him, whispered Scraps. I don't think he can see in the dark the way we can. Before they could go further, however, the giant blew a wave of smoke their way. To their dismay, it caught them and held them fast, clinging to them like heavy molasses. The owl fell to the ground and could not move its wings. The Patchwork Girl stood covered with the sticky substance and could not take a step. "The moon will be over the hill in a little bit," said the giant in a growling voice, "and I shall be able to see you. If you look good to eat, you shall be my breakfast tomorrow at sunup." "I don't think you'll cotton to me," said Scraps cheerfully. "It will be a muggy mouthful." What can we do now?" hooted the owl mournfully. He was much discouraged because his feathers stuck together. The giant took another puff of his pipe, but let the smoke drift away. "A busy fellow am I," he claimed, apparently in a good mood. "I work hard and take a little rest." "What do you work at? Smoking up honest people?" said Scraps boldly. "I think you would be better off to let us go. You won't care for our flavor, especially in this goo." "This smoke is very best. Nothing tastes better than smoked meat," said the giant. "But until I meet you, I can't consider you meat, can I?" He laughed loudly, which set up an echo through the shadowy canyon. "Have a little consideration for our ears," exclaimed Scraps. "You laughed too violently." "According to my excellent sense of smell," continued the giant, "there is very little that is meat about you. The owl I heard a bit ago is probably all you have to offer in that line. However, since I have lived in this canyon, I have learned to eat everything from wood to granite. Very few tasty animals come by here." "What do you live in this canyon for then? Why don't you go away, far away, tonight?" "It's a long story. It all begins with my extra large right hand. See, isn't it a beauty?" He used the stem of his pipe to point at the large hand that he was using for a dam. "I was born from an egg, and as I cracked my way out of the shell, I found myself in a tree. A wind came along and nearly blew me off the limb. I was small in those days, of course, so I grabbed hold and hung on. I hung with one hand for 2 weeks. It grew faster than the rest of me, and when the rest of me began to grow, it was always ahead." Scraps was struggling to pull herself free. "Owl," she said, "what is your name?" "Hoo hoo hunk," was the answer. "All right, hunk. Now why don't you taste this goo? The giant says it has a good taste. I never eat, and I can't taste anything. But if you take a liking to it, you eat us free." "I've already tried," said Hooch, sounding disgusted with it. "I hate the taste." "I caught a panther one night," commented the giant. "He knew good food, and he enjoyed that sticky, smoky stuff very much. He would lap it off almost as fast as I could blow it on him. I always like to see my meals before eating them, and that night there was no moon. But he was so much trouble, I finally gave up and ate him in the dark." "Well, we're in no hurry," declared Scraps. "You will enjoy seeing me, as I am made of the brightest colors, all sewn together in a patchwork body. You must wait until sunup to get the full effect. In fact, noon is best." "I'm worth seeing too," added the owl. "You don't see birds like me every day, mainly because we always come out at night." "I'll wait," said the giant. "I'm not especially hungry, although I have been working as hard as usual." "Working at what?" said Scraps. "I keep the water out of this canyon. First I blow it uphill, and then, while I'm resting, it is running downhill. I catch it in this pool. You don't think I want to get wet, do you? Why not climb out of here and run to some place where there are more panthers?" The giant shook his head. "I promised." When a giant promises, you can be sure that it is a giant-sized promise. A magician caught me in a great trap he had made, and when he saw my large hand, he put me here to take care of the water problem. "What does he care about water? Where is this magician?" inquired the Patchwork Girl. "He has a little retreat here in the canyon. It is a mud and wattle hut over there in a corner. If I let the water in, he would be very angry and would change me into a turtle. So he says. Oh, said Hunk, the owl. So that is why you keep your giant-sized promise. Yes, replied the giant thoughtfully. That seems as good a reason as any, so I keep it in mind. Scraps decided she might have a better chance with a magician than with her present captor. She raised her voice and shouted, Oh, Mr. Magic Man, come here. We hate this sticky stratosphere. There was no response except that a chipmunk ran out from behind a rock, rubbing its nose. It stared at the two prisoners and ran off into the shadows. He may not be here tonight, observed the giant calmly. Sometimes he drops in and sometimes he doesn't. Could we see the hut from here if it were lighted? Asked Hunk. No doubt you could. Then it is dark and he is not here, unless he covers the windows. As the moon began to come over the hill, the shadows in the canyon slowly moved. Soon the hut would be seen, appearing quite small beside the high cliffs, but there were no signs of anyone in it. Also, the giant would now see his captives plainly, and the Patchwork Girl looked so odd to him that he laughed again as loudly as he had before. A crazy quilt girl. You will be rather dull tasting, but you're not dull to see. Then don't you think you had better keep me around to laugh at every night? She asked a little anxiously. And this little owl, continued the giant, here I was thinking of something at least a foot high. I didn't know owls came in such a small size. Really, said the bird hopefully, you who can hardly see me. In fact, I am so small that I would barely fit a crease in your hand. Ah, well, said the giant, you will help to flavor the cotton girl when I eat her like a celery stick with salt on it. I'm no rutabaga with salt on it, warned Scraps. I'll scratch and bite. I'll give you a black eye and jump into it. The giant ignored this, put out his pipe by sticking a thick finger into the fire of it, apparently feeling no pain. Then he stretched his free arm and turned himself so that he was lying stretched out, facing the pool, now almost overflowing his right hand. Well, folks, he said, I won't be able to talk for quite a while now. I have a lot of blowing to do. He drew a deep breath and quickly removed his hand. He blew the water so skillfully that at first it stayed in the pool and then began to climb in its bed up the hill. He must have a magic breath, exclaimed Scraps wonderingly. Look here, Hunk cried in excitement. The light's on. The magician must be there. Just as Scraps turned to see, the door of the shack opened, and out came a person that looked more like an ogre than a man. His head was too large for the rest of his body. His long arms, bare to the elbow, were covered with hair, and his skin looked purple in the moonlight. He was bald, and instead of teeth, there were two tusks coming from his lower jaw over his lip. Oh, this doesn't look good, said Scraps to the owl. I'm beginning to be sorry he came. But as she watched him come toward her, her spirits rose again, for she never was discouraged for long. Hey there, she called. Is this any way to treat strangers? I am from the Emerald City, and my friend, the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger, will not be pleased to hear about this. The ugly magician waddled forward and stared. Then he turned to the giant and said, These are not big enough for you to bother with. I'll bring you a ton of marble to eat today. On the other hand, they will be fine for my breakfast. The giant was too busy to answer, since the water would flow back upon him if he stopped blowing. Whoo, help, cried Honk. We don't want to be breakfast, exclaimed Scraps, struggling once more to be free. Go away, you monster. No, no, said the magician, holding up a claw-like hand. Not without the two of you. He reached for Scraps and the owl, and as he touched them, he said, Suppa, suppa, suppa. Instead, instantly, everything seemed to change. Scraps found herself and Hunk in a room she recognized, the study of the Wizard of Oz. That meant she was in a tower of the palace and back in the Emerald City. At the same time, she realized she was no longer stuck up with gooey smoke substance. Before them, however, still stood the magician. "What is this? And where is who? Who am I? And what are you?" cried Scraps. "That is easy," answered the ugly man. Rapping the knuckles of his fist against each other, he transformed before their eyes into the wizard himself. "Hoo hoo hoo!" shrieked the owl, flapping his wings, and "hoo hoo how!" The wizard, a pleasant little man with friendly eyes, rubbed an emerald lamp, which caused it to glow and light the room. "I'm sorry if you've had a frightening night," he said, "and I'm afraid my disguise didn't help. It's the way I always look when I'm with the giant. Necessary to keep him in awe of me, you know." "Well, he was in awe. You looked just awful," declared Scraps. "I came just as soon as I could," continued the little man, "when my friend the chipmunk rang an alarm bell by tugging on a rope in my hat. You need not have been afraid, however. That giant is no longer able to eat anything but stone. He thinks he can, but he doesn't know that I recently enchanted him so that he cannot even touch anything that lives." By this time, Scraps was no longer especially surprised that the magician had turned out to be the wizard. She had known him to do many unusual tricks before. "What was that about a panther?" she asked. "He told us about it as though it had happened last week." "Oh, no, no, that was long ago. You are the first strangers that have crossed his path, so to speak, in many a day." "Pardon me," said the owl, "but do you two know each other?" "This is the famous Wizard of Oz, and we are now in the capital city," said the Patchwork Girl. She jumped up to sit on a desk and swung her feet. "Wizard, meet my pal Hunk, as hooty as an owl as I have ever known. He wants to get home at the other end of those cliffs we left back there in the moonlight." "That will be simple," said the man. "I have a direct magic route to that canyon, which is my retreat. I can send you back there any time, and you can fly where you can't go, so that the giant cannot catch you with his hand or blow smoke on you. I will put you beyond his reach." "Whoo, whoo, why? Do you have the giant there?" "Partly as a guard and partly to keep my eye on him. I thought keeping the water from my mud hut was a good enough job for a fellow with a big hand and strong lungs like his. It keeps him out of mischief. How did you happen to be so far from home tonight, Scraps?" "I wanted to change," she said, dropping from his desk and trying to jump as high as the ceiling. "It really isn't necessary, though. I can dance and turn somersaults right here in the good old Emerald City." I hope that you have enjoyed this story as much as I have enjoyed reading it for you.